So now that we've talked about the approach and what it does, how do we put it into practice?
That's a wonderful question. I got involved with this to a large extent because in my own practice, I just found myself more and more drawn into having an interest in the process that was going on, what was happening to bring about change. And the more I got interested in process, the further I went from what I was taught, which was to apply a method. And I think it's really interesting that when you're kind of picturing in your mind, okay, I want to help this person activate an old unhealthy pattern so that we can do something about that. It really adds to me a kind of a more precision and more clarity about exactly what we're trying to do as we sit there. I thought it would be useful to go back to one of the earlier steps where we talked about common features of entrenched maladaptive patterns, because if we picture this as kind of three elements, there's one element which is a bunch of circumstances that the person takes in, compares those with what you have in memory, and the brain does a whole lot of calculations to figure out, is this an opportunity or is it a threat? And it comes out, uh-oh, we've got a threat here. And then so that's element one, we can call that appraisal. But how the appraisal is manifested is there's not a little flag that goes up and says this is a threat. What happens is those old primitive emotional centers in the limbic system are activated, like fear or anger or that kind of thing, some sort of negative emotion. And then, so that's element two. And the third element is then that emotion leads to motivation and to the mind designing a response that's going to somehow mitigate that problem. And in fact, with animals and back in evolution, it's a little simpler than that because the response is aimed at getting rid of the threat, right? Okay, but in humans, there are quite a few times where the response is aimed not at doing anything about the threat, but the response is aimed at getting rid of the painful feeling.
The symptom.
The emotion that's of distress, and the mind doesn't really care what caused that emotion, just anything that's gonna quiet it down is okay. And so we do have instances where the response is more designed to address the core painful emotion than it is whatever caused that emotion. Right. It's just interesting. So,
which includes also avoiding feelings as a way of avoiding that signal.
That's exactly right. And that's something that I don't think, I don't know if animals do that or if they have that capacity, but we certainly do in spades. So if we have this picture of three elements going into any given entrenched maladaptive pattern, then it sort of has two aspects to it. There's an emotion that's gotten activated, which we may have some consciousness of, probably do. And if we do, it's affective. It's with bodily changes that we know there's an emotion that's been stirred up there. But there's also an avoidance pattern. There's something that we do. There's a rationalization that pops into your mind, or an activity that you do, like you go and you take a drug so you won't feel anything, or we all are aware that the mind has millions of different ways of dealing with problematic situations. And so there's a behavioral aspect to the entrenched maladaptive pattern, and there's an emotional aspect to it. And in clinical practice, we kind of have a choice about, are we going to work on the avoidance mechanism, are we going to address the rationalizations like CBT does typically, or are we going to try to stay with the activated feeling and do something to put that in a different context, apply a different perspective to it? So which one do we choose? Well, we choose the easiest one, whichever one is more accessible. If the only thing we have is the defense because it's operating so well that you don't feel the feeling, then we're going to address that defense. We're going to address the response pattern. And if the response pattern is relatively minor and we're being overwhelmed with an emotion here, we're going to work with the emotion. So I think clinically, then this model, fits very well and makes it easy to pivot according to the situation between the approach to thoughts, behaviors, feelings that have to do with avoiding this deep down emotion or addressing the emotion directly.
Right. Because we have a roadmap, and the roadmap is to focus on the entrenched maladaptive pattern. And so therefore, whatever the entry point we take at any given point, it is oriented toward that same goal.
I'll give you a couple of examples of sort of techniques or approaches that I've been kind of trying to push to their limits recently in my own practice and in the writing that I've been doing. The first one is the idea of what I've called bracing. It's realizing that for a lot of people, more or less characterologically, or at least habitually, there are avoidance patterns that are sort of built into their way of life, into their style, into their body. For example, a person who doesn't hold themselves upright, they're kind of hunched over, and that's a way of bracing against encountering some kind of a painful emotional situation. And in the way that if a person realizes maybe for the first time, a client, that they've been kind of hunched over and they decide, okay, I'm going to stand up, they will feel very weird, and they'll come into really uncomfortable feelings, and their mind will want to go back to the original position. So I kind of like the idea. I think Wilhelm Reich called it character armor a long time ago. But that's sort of a pugilistic word for it, and I think the idea that we very often brace ourselves in a long-standing habitual way, and what I realized kind of recently is how much that bracing may need to be cleared out before we're going to have any chance of getting close to the emotion that's behind it. Another example is anxiety, is fear.
Just going back to Reich and the character structures is a very interesting way of thinking about character structures as entrenched maladaptive patterns that are actually visible in the posture, in the way of being of the client. And in some ways, all of us have that, all of us are part of a type or another. All of us have these characteristics. So it introduces that notion of entrenched maladaptive patterns, some of which are benign and basically don't prevent us from functioning too well, but others are stronger. And it's not just a question of pathology on the one hand and non-pathology, but just the various ways in which we have patterns and figuring out which ones we can get out of or not.
Right. Another aspect of this, or another application of it, is fear. If you think about it, fear is really something that we stay away from, something that makes us afraid. But the fear is the anticipation of experiencing something that we really dread. The fear isn't the same as the dread. It's sort of another layer of better not get close to that. And so this has been helpful to me in thinking that that fear is part of a response pattern itself. Fear is a way that the mind sets us up to keep miles away from whatever it is that it really is dreading getting close to.
But here we're
So
talking about an extra layer. In addition to the fear, there's the fear of the fear.
exactly, yes. So where that got me in my thinking was, well, wait a minute. So fear of what? This fear of fear. And and so another word kind of came to mind that's again been sort of useful clinically, and that is what I like to call the dread. That we all have things that we dread. And that's the really, really bad stuff that we don't want to get anywhere close to. And what I've been doing clinically is I sort of had this idea that, that the only way you're going to heal this primitive, deep, dark feeling is by having it all activated and out in front of you, somewhat the way that happens with trauma. But I think not. What I found is if you talk to people about, well, what is it that you have this fear and you don't want to get anywhere near the experience of, let's say, finding yourself inadequate or being criticized by somebody, but what really is it that would happen if you got criticized? What is it that you've been working so hard to stay miles away from? Let's try to understand that as best we can. And what that leads to is at first, a somewhat intellectual conversation, but people are quite receptive to the idea. And then kind of creeping towards and looking past the curtain a little bit at it. And it doesn't matter that it starts out as a more superficial, more cognitive kind of inquiry, because eventually you get closer and closer to the real thing, the real horror. And I mean, one of my most interesting examples recently, and maybe I mentioned it in the previous conversation, was a woman who is very, very afraid of death. Okay, well, everybody's afraid of death. But it turns out, now, did I mention this before?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. It turns out that the fear of death is not about death at all. It's about losing the vision of herself growing into somebody, into somebody of substance. She's really bright, really creative, and has never had a chance to kind of get off the ground. And death would mean that those hopes and wishes are all dashed and for naught. And so that's what the dread is. It's having all of these hopes and losing them. Sometimes the dread that people respond to has to do with feeling responsible for a task and not having the resources to be sure of succeeding with it. And there's the feeling that oh my gosh, maybe I'm going to have this catastrophic failure to be responsible. A man who spent his life with anxiety, it looked like the dread that was behind that anxiety was that his dad had heart problems when he was a little kid. And the worry was that the dad would die, which was okay, but then he would be the man of the house. And as a little kid felt like he would be responsible for somehow carrying on as an adult. And he knew that he wasn't up to the job. And that was his dread. So anyway, it's been a very rich source of really, really useful clinical material to say, let's keep going as deep as we can to understand exactly what is the most fundamental, most terrifying thing that's driving all of these entrenched maladaptive patterns.
And so I'm hearing you going deeper into the meaning of it, not stopping at the initial meaning of it. For instance, the fear of death, okay, yeah, of course, it's understandable. Fear of death, no,
right.
You don't take it for granted. You just go deeper to understand a little more what it is.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that since we're talking about something where there is the very strong power of affect, that we're not just staying in words But
Mhm.
whether or not the theory of the therapy is about emotion, that some emotion has to
Mhm.
be involved in order to
Mhm.
have that reconsolidation.
Exactly. That's right. Well, that's the gold standard. But the good news is you don't have to have it all at once. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It can be a little bit at a time, and you can work your way down to that level when we're dealing with something that has been, dreaded and defended against for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned early on that usually there are several maladaptive patterns that people have. And so how do they relate to each other?
Well, that's really interesting. Think of the layers of defense in a castle. You have the keep, the thick wall building at the very middle, and then there's another set of walls, and then there's a moat, and then there's maybe it's situated on a hill, and there are cliffs, and so in order to attack the castle, you have to get through these successive defensive things, and entrenched maladaptive patterns are a little bit like that. I think a better metaphor is sort of a piling up of one on top of the other, starting with whatever thing was a big challenge in the earliest childhood. And the way the mind works, I think, is generally organized around one or two terrible experiences. And a really simple one that I like to use is somebody sort of like Huckleberry Finn, who's a tough guy who starts out in a family where there's a lot of deprivation of the need for nurturing and attention and things like that. And the first layer of defense is avoidance, is just plain avoidance. Don't ask for anything, don't need anything. But the mind doesn't work that way because those kinds of needs are essential for people. They're like oxygen. And so Huckleberry goes ahead and he seeks attention within the family, and he gets slammed for it. He gets hurt. So that's one layer of defense that doesn't work. What triggers the next layer, the next entrenched maladaptive pattern, is the fact that the first one isn't working. And so the next one for him is he develops a value system that says it's good to be a tough guy. You can be proud to be a tough guy, and it's shameful to have needs. And how many males in our culture have that kind of value system? Well, that value system is a very effective deterrent to seeking support and warmth and nurturing. And so it stands him in pretty good stead. And then he gets a pretty nice job, and he gets a promotion, and then his wife is pregnant, and he's freaking out because he doesn't know if he's going to have the resources to fulfill those responsibilities, and he really needs some support. And so the support is threatening to break through his maladaptive, his two layers of maladaptive entrenched patterns. So what happens? He has a panic attack. And the panic attack is another maladaptive entrenched pattern. It's another pattern that gets him some attention automatically and gets him out of the situation of responsibility, at least temporarily. And then he goes to therapy, and the therapist says, well, maybe we're going to have to look at your needs for support here. And oh my gosh. And so he says, well, I'm only in this therapy because I have to, because the doctor told me to. And I really thought that I was just going to come for one session and then not anymore after that. We have yet another entrenched maladaptive pattern that appears, a rationalization that I only need one session of therapy. And so that's kind of how these maladaptive patterns are layered, including resistance within the therapy, the thing that we traditionally think of as resistance, because the therapy is a threat. It's a threat because it's going to take away those tried and true defenses that have kept his emotional life stable for years and years and years. So it's a very flexible concept, and one one maladaptive pattern is triggered by the anticipation of the failure of the one below.
Right, right. So it's very much a model of adaptation, and say that the biggest problem, you find an adaptation, and then you continue jerry-rigging by adding more and more and more stopgap stuff, because you know that the adaptive patterns below just simply are not that useful. And you have the pyramid.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way, like his being a tough guy becomes a way, the thing that he dreads is the shame that's associated with weakness.
Yeah.
And so the dread in that case is different. It's shame is the thing that he's worried about not being rebuffed or deprived by the people that he cares about, which was the original problem. So the nature of the dread is different for each one of those maladaptive patterns, and it varies somewhat, but ultimately they're all solutions to the same original problem.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So that's an aspect of the model that I don't talk about too much because it's a little bit complicated, but it really is one of the...
There's a elegant simplicity to it that is, essentially, we're not dealing with a problem or an issue or a particular set of behaviors, but we're understanding the whole person. And how that person has figured out a way to be in the world that is actually problematic. And so we're thinking in terms of process. There is a process that has made a person be who they are. And, various layers to this process.
Yeah.
And going back to helping this person be in the world by retracing these processes.
Yeah. Yeah. And, clinically, again, the principle is sort of the same as, do we do the behavior or do we go for the emotion? It's we go after whichever layer is the most accessible.
Yeah. So maybe as a conclusion to this, I would like to invite people who listen to this to have some curiosity about the way that each of you is actually applying this already in the way you do therapy. Not so much to say I should do it and how do I do it, but if my therapy works and if this approach is one that describes any therapy that works, in what way does the way you do therapy follow this approach?